our state is now in a chronic bank run. We call it the balance of payment deficit. We do not have sufficient dollars to pay our creditors without exhausting forex reserves. And hence we need to knock at the doors of the IMF. Why we have reached at this stage? Why we have lost economic sovereignty? In other words, why we lost economic freedom as a nation? This economic freedom has two dimensions. One is the ability to take economic decisions independently. This economic freedom is the freedom available to the private citizens of a country to undertake businesses and freedom to grow these businesses, including freedom to do trade domestically and internationally. While apparently we have this freedom because you can register your business today in one day, you can open an account in a week, and you can literally start your business in the very next week. In effect, we perform rather poorly on the index of or indices of economic freedom. For example, Pakistan is ranked at 147 out of 184 countries, and it is classified as a repressed economy with a score of 49.5 according to the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom. Now consider what are the other four categories of economic freedom in which all the countries in the world are ranked. These four categories are mostly unfree, moderately free, mostly free, and free. We have been classified as mostly unfree for the last 25 years. However, now we are downgraded to the lowest category according to this index, which is repressive. An interesting development is that Pakistan was also recently downgraded to authoritarian category, down from hybrid on another index which ranks the state of democracy, published by the Economist Intelligence Unit. I argue that the external economic freedom, which is the ability of a sovereign to make and enforce economic decisions, is a direct outcome of the intrinsic economic freedom, which is the ability of subjects of a sovereign to take economic decisions. Thus, the level of economic freedom available within a country directly impact the level of economic sovereignty of the nation. And there are various methods to explain the economic freedom. For instance, the Fraser Institute has 5 categories, which are size of the government, legal and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and business regulations. The Heritage Index has 12 categories, which are property rights, government integrity, judicial effectiveness, tax burden, government spending, fiscal health, business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom, and trade freedom, etc. And there are many overlaps between the two indices, both Heritage Index and Fraser Institute Index. Conventionally, when we talk about economic freedom, we have related the economic freedom with the size of the government always. So theoretically, we have always maintained that the greater is the size of the government and its presence in the economy, lesser is the economic freedom, though there is possibly an inverse relationship between the two. In that respect, Pakistan surprisingly scores quite high according to, let's say, one of these index, the Fraser one. And it gives Pakistan a score of 8 out of 10, which is, of course, a very high score. However, this masks the complexity of government regulations and red tape, which impedes entrepreneurship and free market competition. With a 20% size in our GDP, our formal government structure is not that huge. So merely size of the government or its inverse is not an accurate indicator of economic freedom. Here one can refer to estimates by Quaid, which estimates that the footprint of the government can be as high as 70% of GDP, 70%, when the impact of onerous regulations is included. Economic freedom can mean different things to different actors. For example, an IT startup may find that internet closure or an interruption, or you have often heard of the sharks which cut the undersea cables, is the biggest hindrance in its freedom. A large conglomerate can find its freedom taken away or reduced considerably when more than 50% of its income is usurped in the name of taxes. A globally integrated export company can find that permission required by the Economic Coordination Committee to buy assets or companies for which it needs to remit capital is a hurdle in its economic freedom. For a commercial importer, when it has to pay up to 50% of its import value as advance payment to FBR, it means a threat to its economic freedom. For consumers, absence of choice is the degree of loss in economic freedom. This usually results from lack of competition in markets and creation of monopolies when they are created as a result of a government decree. For consumers, more economic freedom demands greater degree of choice in terms of products and prices. In terms of access to credit, government presence and its share in the market of capital thus makes a huge impact on the economic freedom. In our case, approximately 60% of commercial credit is consumed by the federal government. Of what remains, most of the capital then goes to the established large-scale players, thus denying access to credit to smaller economic players across sectors, especially in the agriculture and SMEs. This has an effect as incumbents get strengthened. In certain sectors, government-owned companies, including those run by the armed forces or their welfare foundations, dominate market share. For example, the oil and gas exploration and imports are dominated by the state-owned enterprises. Entire distribution and transmission of electricity is in the hands of the state. In the real estate and infrastructure construction sectors, we see companies linked with the military dominating the businesses. Due to their access to government, these companies, state-owned enterprises, can have preferential access to information, if not preferential treatment in terms of taxes and NOCs. One recent example is that while the federal government is making the aggressive announcements for right-sizing its departments, exemptions are being granted to departments which are affiliated with the defense sectors. On the other hand, sectors in which liberalization has allowed private sector to operate simultaneously with the SOEs, the private sector has outpaced the government. Commercial air traffic is a good example where we have several good quality private airlines operating both in the country and internationally. Thus, the lack of level playing field clearly reduces economic freedom available in a country. It then denies opportunities of growth available to middle and large-sized companies, as big-ticket projects are often taken by the government-owned companies. We should now see that the manifestations of economic freedom in our context. If the private sector, these are the consequences of less degree of economic freedom. If the private sector and professionals working in this sector do not demonstrate growth, it ultimately brings the national income down. At the same time, when the government is not doing anything to reduce its spending, either current or development or defense, then obviously one familiar thing kicks in. We call it the fiscal deficit. This then forces the government to borrow more as it cannot raise sufficient taxes to meet its expenses successfully. More borrowing reduces the bargaining power of the government. Increasingly, we have seen that the government is also pledging assets against borrowing, especially in the global sukuk markets. Many national assets, including our motorways and airports, have been pledged several times. The economic crisis that we face today can be reduced to, therefore, an insolvent federal government, and we should propose measures to make it solvent. It is not the crisis of the economy as a whole. We are not witnessing street protests of jobless youth, and I hope that you will not join those protesting youth and find good career for yourself, as highlighted by Dr. Zaid Asfar just now. An insolvent government not only reduces economic freedom, but it also poses a huge national security risk. The main cause of economic unfreedom is an insolvent government, and once we make the government fiscally feasible, Pakistan's economy will be on the track of prosperity. We observe, therefore, two simultaneous movements. The stagnant or decreasing internal economic freedom, as I mentioned to you, various levels of various reports published by Economic Freedom Index, and at the same time decreasing external economic freedom, or economics of reality, as measured by the IMF programs, rollovers, and reprofiling of public debt. And both dimensions of economic freedom, the internal and external, are closely associated. This hypothesis may be subject of some empirical research where the left-hand side of a linear equation, which is the dependent variable, is economic sovereignty, and right-hand side of the equation, the independent variable, is economic freedom. And I'm sure the students who are, especially the research students of economics, find this hypothetical equation of interest for their empirical research. And you can get sufficient data from these indices, which I have outlined in my speech earlier. So where do we go from here? In other words, what needs to be done? But before I present these ideas, I would like to caution all of you. When we talk about these proposals, these ideas, these suggestions, I usually receive one comment. Comment ये होता है कि जी political will नहीं है, implementation नहीं हो रही है, government ये कर रही है. But I always urge that as students of economics, you should first debate an idea before talking about political will, because that is outside this classroom. The idea of economics as a theory is to teach you tools and framework to evaluate these proposals on their merit, rather than immediately linking it with the political dispensation. So let's focus on whether these ideas or other ideas which are going to be presented in this conference have any merit or not. And I think that we need to, frankly, imagine very radical changes in the federal government, which is possibly the main cause of a default if it were to happen. And going forward, I propose 3 shocks in the economic structure of the federal government. We have seen examples of incremental reforms many times, and it is happening across the government as we speak today. Across the secretariat, across the ministries, you will find projects after projects in the name of reforms. But all those reforms are primarily designed not for reform, but to obtain loans and to obtain forex reserves. So the intent of the government is not to reform, the intent of the government is to secure additional loans or forex reserves, or to enhance forex reserve. So that is what I'm proposing. So, and for these reforms, we don't need any technical assistance. First proposal, in my view, is the abolishment of FBR, the Federal Board of Revenue, along with the announcement of a simple and harmonized tax policy, which has been outlined already by Pied Prime Tax Reforms Commission, released earlier. Once the complexity in the tax structure and tax code is removed, we no longer need an army of bureaucrats to make the tax and tariff code more complex than what has become of it already. Withdrawal of additional custom and regulatory duties, imposing a low rate of GST or VAT, withdrawal of income tax exemptions, uniform rate of income tax, and withdrawal of extortionary taxes like super tax are main features of this proposal. Secondly, we need to announce that all commercial SOEs will be free to declare bankruptcy if they are reporting continuous losses and close down their operations forever. And their lands can be sold in commercial markets, and endowment or insurance fund can be set up to finance salaries of their employees for a defined tenure. If SOEs are making profit, then the government should announce immediate privatization. Instead of offering loss-making units for privatization, which no one will buy, we should offer profit-making units for privatization to both domestic and global investors. Necessary amendments in the law should be introduced to reduce the timelines. And if there are state-owned enterprises which are related to defense or essential services, they should be decorporatized and enlisted as government departments so that these services can continue. And Prime Institute will be soon unveiling Pakistan's first ever comprehensive privatization policy framework as a proposal. Thirdly, we should also abolish the Planning Commission in its present form and hand over pipeline of projects to the line ministries and announce a complete stop on new PSDB projects. All economists and sectoral experts, there are hundreds of them working there, should be permanently deputed to the respective ministries and divisions who will monitor the progress of projects on the field and develop knowledge base. Immediate transfer of income support program and power subsidies where it is needed to provincial governments and will substantially reduce the burden on the federal government. After 18th Amendment, the social sector spending is the exclusive domain of provinces, not the federal government. And we do not need to run and maintain a huge income support program at the level of federal government. Immediate withdrawal of corporate subsidies, exemptions, and privileges will also reduce significantly government spending. A sharp reduction in the government spending through these measures will immediately relieve the pressure to collect more taxes, which have proven detrimental to economic growth and economic freedom. Instead of doubling our tax to GDP ratio, we should think about slashing the government to half. If the government is currently 20% of GDP, at least in its formal sense, then a government size at 10% of GDP implies that our fiscal deficit will be zero overnight, while maintaining current levels of tax collection. Once we achieve the growth in collection, which is bound to occur as a result of reforms we have proposed, we can invest in facilities such as high-quality education, especially at the primary level, health, and internet connectivity for all. All of these steps can be implemented successfully in one fiscal year. This will usher a new era of economic growth for the nation without burdening the private sector, which is the engine of growth. This will happen through largely two channels. One is the fiscal channel, which will be in the form of reduced tax rates, thus encouraging investment and consumer spending. Secondly, it will happen through credit flow to the private sector as the government appetite to borrow will reduce and commercial banks will chase the private sector to meet their targets. I mentioned earlier that we cannot isolate economic freedom from political freedom. I bridged the two concepts finally by saying that we need economic democracy, a path that most recently adopted by Indonesia. Building on the democratic maturity of its political class, the Indonesians defined a wide range of economic reforms under the rubric of economic democracy, which essentially meant that special privileges from incumbent corporate groups, including those run by the state, were withdrawn and resources were allocated to ensure that a new class of entrepreneurs are encouraged to enter the market and thrive without any government support. It is doing a miracle already in the largest Muslim country. It can also do a miracle in the second largest Muslim country, Pakistan. Thank you so much for your attention this morning.